The storm had already forced the sponge divers off course once before. By the spring of 1900, the sea around Antikythera was still rough enough that few wanted to enter the water at all. One diver went down anyway. Wearing a heavy canvas suit and copper helmet, Elias Stadiatis disappeared into the darkness until his lamp reached the seafloor nearly 50 meters below. At first there was only rock and darkness, then shapes began to appear. A face, an arm, bodies scattered across the seafloor. When Stadiatis resurfaced, the crew thought the dive had affected his mind. Shaking badly, he tried to explain what he had seen below. Naked figures lying across the rocks, partially buried in the sediment, as though a ship full of dead people had been thrown into the sea and left there untouched. The bodies were not bodies at all. They were bronze statues, and more than a century later, nobody is completely sure what Antikythera really was. Long before the wreck near Antikythera became famous, sailors already knew the sea around the island could turn dangerous without warning. Antikythera sits between Crete and mainland Greece, along ancient trade routes linking the eastern Mediterranean to the west, and ships crossing that passage often had little choice but to navigate narrow stretches exposed to strong currents, sudden storms, and hidden rock formations just below the surface. Even today, the coastline feels isolated. Steep cliffs rise directly from the water, while below them the seabed falls sharply into deep channels where visibility can vanish almost instantly when the weather changes. For ancient ships built from timber and driven only by sail, the route demanded precision at the exact place the sea was least predictable. And yet the traffic never stopped. Merchant vessels, military transports, private cargo, luxury goods moving between the Greek world and the growing power of Rome. All of it passed through a corridor capable of swallowing entire voyages without leaving enough behind for anyone to recover. For centuries, the sea around Antikythera erased ships completely. Then in 1900, it finally returned one. Within days of Elias Stadiatis' first descent, the divers returned to the site with orders to recover whatever lay below the cliffs of Antikythera. What they found was scattered across the seafloor: bronze limbs trapped between rocks, marble figures resting on their sides, fragments of wood from a ship that had vanished nearly 2,000 years earlier. The work quickly became dangerous. The wreck rested at depths approaching 50 meters, far beyond what most divers of the time could safely endure for long. Wearing heavy canvas suits supplied with air through hoses from the surface, the sponge divers descended repeatedly into cold water, where visibility could disappear almost instantly when the currents shifted. Every object had to be raised slowly by rope from terrain, uneven enough to trap both cargo and men. And still, they kept returning. One by one, statues began rising from the sea. A bronze youth, marble horses, detached arms and heads coated in coral and hardened mineral growth after centuries underwater. Newspapers across Europe followed the recovery as though part of the ancient world itself was being lifted back into daylight. But the longer the operation continued, the worse the condition of the divers became. Several suffered severe decompression sickness, a condition still poorly understood at the time. One diver died during the recovery effort. Others were left partially paralyzed after ascending too quickly from repeated descents. Centuries earlier, the wreck had claimed one ship. Now it was injuring the men trying to uncover it. By the time the first major recovery operation ended in 1901, archaeologists believed they had already brought up the most important objects from the site. But they were wrong. At first, the wreck near Antikythera seemed almost explainable. Extraordinary, certainly, but still recognizable as a large Roman-era cargo ship carrying wealth across the Mediterranean before being destroyed somewhere off the island's cliffs. Then, archaeologists began looking more carefully at what had actually come out of the water. The cargo did not resemble ordinary trade goods packed for a routine voyage. Alongside amphorae and ship equipment were bronze statues so rare that few comparable examples survive even today. In the ancient world, bronze sculptures were routinely melted down and reused during wars, economic collapse, or political change. Most vanished centuries ago, yet Antikythera had preserved them. Some statues were Greek originals already hundreds of years old, by the time the ship likely sank sometime around the middle of the 1st century BCE. Others appeared Roman. Marble figures rested beside bronze works created in entirely different artistic traditions, as though objects from separate worlds had somehow ended up aboard the same vessel, and the scale of the cargo only deepened the unease. Luxury glassware, fine jewelry, furniture fragments, decorated vessels, massive sculptures requiring enormous effort to transport safely across open water. This was not the kind of shipment associated with merchant routes carrying grain or olive oil between ports. Whatever the ship had carried, it represented immense wealth concentrated into a single voyage. One explanation seemed possible. By the 1st century BCE, Rome's elite had developed an enormous appetite for Greek art. Statues, monuments, and luxury objects were transported across the Mediterranean to decorate villas, temples, and private collections as Roman influence expanded deeper into the Greek world. Antikythera may have been carrying part of that movement, a floating archive of culture and status bound for the West. At least that was the theory. Because the deeper archaeologists examined the wreck, the less connected the objects began to seem. As the decades passed, the wreck near Antikythera became harder to describe as a single coherent discovery. The statues alone no longer fit together cleanly. Some existed only as isolated fragments recovered years apart, a bronze arm without a body, a face detached from the figure it once belonged to, marble limbs resting far from the sculptures they had broken away from, either during the sinking or in the centuries that followed along the seafloor. Archaeologists could identify styles, estimate dates, compare artistic techniques, yet in many cases they could no longer reconstruct the original objects with certainty. Survival remained. Context did not, and gradually the same thing began happening to the people aboard the ship. Human remains were eventually recovered from the site, but not in ways that revealed much about the people themselves. No surviving records identified who had crossed these waters or where they had been traveling when the ship disappeared beneath the sea. Teeth, bones, and scattered traces of individuals survived beneath the wreck, separated not only from one another, but from nearly everything that could explain their lives. Meanwhile, the cargo itself continued resisting a simple explanation. Objects appeared to originate from different periods, different workshops, perhaps even different regions of the Mediterranean world. Some may already have been antiques when they were loaded onto the vessel. Others remain difficult to identify even now, preserved only as damaged forms hardened beneath coral and mineral growth after centuries underwater. What returned from Antikythera often returned incompletely, not destroyed enough to vanish, not preserved clearly enough to fully understand. And over time, the site began producing a strange imbalance. Archaeologists could describe statues in extraordinary detail while knowing almost nothing about the people who carried them across the Mediterranean. The cargo became famous. The passengers dissolved into anonymity. The deeper researchers looked into Antikythera, the less complete the story seemed to become. Then they realized one of the most important objects recovered from the wreck had already been sitting unnoticed for years. Among the objects recovered from the wreck near Antikythera was a lump of corroded material so damaged that at first it attracted almost no attention at all. It did not resemble a statue. It carried none of the visual impact of the bronze figures emerging from the water. Covered in marine deposits and hardened by centuries underwater, it appeared to be just another mass of corrosion fused together on the seafloor after nearly 2,000 years below the surface. For a time, it sat largely unnoticed among the other recovered objects. Then cracks began appearing across its surface. Inside were gears. Tiny, interlocking bronze teeth preserved so tightly within the concretion that researchers initially struggled to understand what they were even looking at. Nothing comparable had ever been recovered from the ancient world. The more the object was examined, the stranger it became. Layers of mechanical components compressed together inside a device broken apart long before anyone modern had seen it. But what matters about the mechanism is not simply what it was. It is the fact that archaeologists had already recovered it without recognizing its importance. One of the most extraordinary artifacts ever found from the ancient Mediterranean spent years existing only as a damaged object among countless others brought up from the wreck. Historians, conservators, and museum workers had physically handled it before anyone understood what had survived inside. And suddenly, Antikythera changed again. Because if something this significant could remain hidden inside a corroded mass sitting in plain sight, then the site no longer felt merely incomplete. It began feeling difficult to interpret at a fundamental level. Objects recovered from the seabed had survived in conditions so distorted that even experts could fail to recognize what they already possessed. The mechanism did not solve the wreck, it destabilized it. Instead of creating certainty, it introduced a more unsettling possibility: that other discoveries from Antikythera may still be misunderstood, misidentified, or waiting unnoticed inside objects that appear ordinary at first glance. And by then, archaeologists were already beginning to suspect the wreck extended far beyond the original site. For much of the 20th century, it was easy to assume the wreck near Antikythera had already surrendered most of its secrets. The first recovery operations had produced statues, luxury cargo, fragments of the mechanism, ship remains, and human bones in quantities extraordinary enough to define the site for generations. Museums displayed the discoveries. Researchers studied them for decades. The story appeared established, then divers returned. Modern expeditions revealed something unsettling almost immediately. The wreck did not end where archaeologists once believed it ended. Advanced diving equipment, robotic imaging systems, and renewed surveys along the cliffs of Antikythera began exposing debris spread across a far larger area than early explorers could safely investigate. Sections of cargo appeared buried beneath layers of sediment and fallen rock. In some places, the terrain itself seemed to have shifted over centuries, carrying objects downslope into deeper water, beyond the limits of the original recovery efforts. The site was not a single clean deposit resting untouched on the seafloor. It was scattered. Anchors emerged from areas outside the original excavation zone. Additional ship components appeared in places earlier divers could never safely reach. Human remains continued to surface long after the first salvage operations had ended. Archaeologists began considering the possibility that major portions of the vessel, and perhaps some of its cargo, still remained trapped beneath rockfall along the underwater cliffs, including statues. That possibility changed the scale of Antikythera again. If large sections of the wreck still lie buried beneath collapsed stone and deep sediment, then the version preserved inside museums may represent only part of what actually sank there, not a reconstructed whole, a partial survival. And that realization alters everything that came before it. The statues, the unidentified objects, the human remains, even the mechanism itself may belong to a wreck field, still incomplete enough to reshape interpretation every time divers return to the site. More than a century after the first descent near Antikythera, archaeologists are still recovering objects from the darkness below the cliffs, which means the wreck is not only unfinished as a story, it may still be unfinished as a discovery. More than 2,000 years ago, a ship disappeared beneath the waters near Antikythera, carrying statues, luxury cargo, mechanical fragments, and people whose names no longer survive anywhere in the historical record. Storms buried the wreck. Coral formed across bronze faces. Wood collapsed under the pressure of the sea, while entire centuries passed above it unnoticed. Then the seabed began returning objects, not as a complete story, but in pieces. A hand separated from the statue it once belonged to. Human bones detached from identities. Cargo without certainty. Objects recovered decades apart from a wreck still expanding beyond its original boundaries. For more than a century, archaeologists have tried to reconstruct what happened near Antikythera from whatever the sea allowed to remain. But the deeper the site is explored, the harder it becomes to see the wreck as something fully recoverable. The statues survived. The mechanism survived. Even parts of the ship survived. But whatever once connected them disappeared into the sea long ago.